If you are one of those drivers who hear the words ECU reset, ECU relearn, ECU reprogramming, ECU flashing, and ECU reset after battery disconnect, and you assume all of those things mean the same thing, well, they do not. And if you mix them up, you can end up expecting a reset to fix a mechanical problem, or thinking a software reflash is the same thing as clearing adaptive memory. It is not. So in this video, I am going to break this down as much as I can to show you what the ECU actually does, when resetting the ECU can help, when it will not help at all, the difference between ECU reset and ECU reprogramming, and how to reset it properly with a scanner and without a scanner. With that said, what is an ECU? The ECU, or Engine Control Unit, is the computer that manages many of the engine's operating decisions. It uses input from sensors around the car and then adjusts things like fuel delivery, ignition timing, idle behavior, throttle response, emissions-related operation, and, in many vehicles, part of the communication that affects transmission behavior as well. So when you press the accelerator, you are not directly commanding the engine the way many people imagine. In a modern vehicle, you are sending a request. The ECU reads that request, checks sensor data, compares it to its programming, and then tells the engine how to respond. It looks at things like throttle position, oxygen sensor feedback, air intake data, engine coolant temperature, and more. Then it makes decisions in real time. That is why the ECU matters so much. It is not just a box sitting there. It is constantly learning, adjusting, and correcting. And this leads directly to the reason people talk about resetting it in the first place. Why does resetting the ECU sometimes help? Over time, the ECU stores what are called adaptive values, or learned memory. These are adjustments the computer makes based on sensor feedback, engine wear, carbon buildup, driving style, and conditions over time. In many cases, that helps the vehicle run better because the ECU is not relying only on fixed factory values. It is adapting. But sometimes those learned corrections are based on a problem. Maybe the throttle body was dirty. Maybe a mass airflow sensor was weak. Maybe an oxygen sensor was reading badly. Maybe the battery was low. Or maybe the engine had been compensating for a vacuum leak or poor idle condition. Then you fix that problem, replace the bad parts, or clean the component, but the ECU may still be carrying old learned behavior based on the faulty condition. That is where a reset can help. Resetting the ECU can clear learned adaptive memory and give the system a chance to start fresh. It forces the vehicle into a relearn process where it builds new values based on current sensor data instead of old corrections. And yes, sometimes that really does make a noticeable difference. For example, if a car had poor idle behavior because it had adapted around a dirty throttle body or a weak sensor, then the bad part gets replaced, a reset may help the ECU stop relying on those old learned adjustments. After a proper relearn drive, the engine may idle smoother, respond better, and behave more normally. But this is where people go wrong. Resetting the ECU is not a repair by itself. It does not fix a vacuum leak. It does not repair a bad ignition coil. It does not heal a slipping transmission. And it does not permanently solve a check engine light if the actual problem is still there. A reset only clears learned memory and, depending on the method and vehicle, may also clear stored trouble codes. If the fault still exists, the problem usually comes right back. So, before we go any further, just remember this. A reset can only help your computer to relearn new data, but it cannot fix broken parts. Now, let's clear up one of the biggest sources of confusion. ECU reset versus ECU reprogramming. These are not the same thing. An ECU reset usually means clearing learned values, adaptive memory, and, in some cases, stored codes, depending on the method used and the vehicle design. It is basically the system starting over from baseline learned behavior. It is not new software. It is the same software, starting with less memory of past driving conditions. ECU reprogramming, on the other hand, means changing or updating the software in the module itself. That can be a factory update from the manufacturer to fix a drivability issue, emissions issue, cold start issue, transmission behavior issue, or some other known calibration problem. It can also refer to aftermarket tuning or remapping, where performance-related settings are altered.
That distinction matters.
Reset means clean memory.
Reprogramming means changed software.
And this is why you should be careful with broad claims online. Not every ECU reprogramming job is a performance upgrade. Sometimes it is just a manufacturer software update. And not every reset gives more power or better fuel economy. Sometimes it just removes the old adaptations so the car can relearn properly. Now let's talk about the actual benefits of an ECU reset, because there are real situations where it can make sense. One of the best times to reset the ECU is after replacing certain major engine-related parts, especially ones the computer relies on heavily for correction data. That can include a throttle body, mass airflow sensor, oxygen sensor, battery, or, in some cases, after cleaning heavy carbon buildup that affected airflow or idle. If the ECU had adapted around the old condition, resetting it can help it stop using outdated correction patterns. Another situation is after drivability issues related to idle or throttle behavior have been corrected. If the idle had become unstable because of learned compensation and the root issue has already been fixed, resetting the learned values may help the system settle faster during the relearn process. It can also be useful after clearing up a fuel trim problem caused by a bad sensor. If the engine had been running rich or lean because of bad sensor input, and you already replaced that sensor, the ECU may still hold trim corrections based on the old problem. Resetting may help the computer rebuild cleaner fuel trim values from the repaired condition. And yes, sometimes people reset the ECU after a check engine light issue has been repaired, and they want to clear codes and allow the monitors to begin again. That can be part of the process. But remember, clearing the light is not the same as solving the problem. That is why so many people say, "I cleared the code, but it came back."
Of course it came back.
You erased the message. You did not necessarily remove the cause. Now, let's talk about ECU reprogramming benefits, because this is where people often hear exaggerated claims. A proper factory reprogramming update can improve drivability if the manufacturer released new calibration for a known issue. It can help with things like idle behavior, shift strategy on some platforms, sensor sensitivity, hesitation, cold start performance, and, in some cases, emissions-related logic. That is real and valid. Aftermarket reprogramming or tuning is a different world. That can increase power, change throttle response, alter boost targets on turbo vehicles, and change fuel and timing strategy. But that is not a free lunch. When tuning is done aggressively or poorly, it can increase stress, create drivability issues, increase heat, and in some cases contribute to engine damage. So I would not present reprogramming as automatically better. It depends on why it is being done, how it is being done, and whether the vehicle is in good condition to begin with. When should you never reset the ECU? Do not use a reset as a shortcut when the engine is actively warning you that something serious is wrong. If the check engine light is flashing, that often points to an active misfire severe enough to risk catalytic converter damage. If the engine is knocking, overheating, or the transmission is slipping badly, a reset is not your first move. In those situations, resetting can distract you from the real problem and delay proper diagnosis. So if the car is showing major warning symptoms, diagnose first. Do not reset first and hope. Now let's get practical. How do you reset the ECU with a scanner? This is usually the best and cleanest method because it gives you more control and lets you see what is going on before you erase anything. Start by plugging the scanner into the OBD2 port. Turn the ignition to the on position without starting the engine if your vehicle requires that for scan communication. Then read the trouble codes first. Always read and record the codes before clearing anything. That part matters because once you erase them, you also erase valuable diagnostic information. After recording the codes, use the scanner to clear trouble codes or perform the reset function if your scan tool has one. Some higher-end scanners may also have specific relearn or adaptation reset functions for certain systems. After that, start the engine and let it idle for several minutes without pressing the accelerator aggressively. Then drive the car normally so the relearn process can begin. And that brings us to resetting without a scanner. The most common old-school method is disconnecting the battery. Turn the vehicle off completely, remove the key, and disconnect the negative battery terminal. On many vehicles, leaving it disconnected for around 15 to 30 minutes may clear some adaptive memory. After reconnecting, the ECU may begin relearning from a more basic starting point. Now, I want to be careful here. Battery disconnect is not a universal magic reset for every vehicle. On some modern cars, certain memory is retained, and some codes or module behavior may not clear the way people expect. Also, disconnecting the battery can erase radio presets, clock settings, window memory, seat memory, and other learned settings depending on the vehicle. So this method can work in some cases, but it is not the same as a full software reprogramming, and it is not always the best method. Another method some people use is removing the ECU or ECM fuse briefly, but I would present that with caution. Fuse layouts vary, labeling varies, and pulling the wrong fuse can create confusion or unintended problems. So unless the user is looking at a reliable fuse diagram for that exact vehicle, I would not present fuse pulling as the first recommendation over using a scanner or battery disconnect. Now let's talk about what happens after a reset, because this is where many viewers panic and think they made things worse. After an ECU reset, the car may not feel perfect right away. Idle may be higher than normal or fluctuate for a short time, because the ECU is relearning idle control and throttle behavior. Throttle response may feel different because the computer is not yet working from the same adaptive patterns it had built over time. Fuel trims need time to rebuild. In some vehicles, transmission shift feel may also change temporarily while related systems adapt again. That is why the relearn phase matters. After a reset, let the engine idle for a few minutes, then drive the car gently under mixed conditions so the ECU can relearn airflow, throttle behavior, fuel trim behavior, and other normal operating patterns. It may take some driving time before the vehicle feels fully settled again. That does not necessarily mean something is wrong. It often means the relearn process is still happening. But again, if the vehicle has a real unresolved fault, no amount of relearn will hide it forever. Now let's simplify this. Reset the ECU if you have already corrected the underlying problem and want the system to stop relying on old learned behavior. Do not reset the ECU expecting it to fix a broken part. Use a scanner when possible because it is cleaner, more controlled, and lets you record codes first. Treat battery disconnect as a basic reset method, not a cure-all. Understand that reprogramming is different from resetting. So the next time someone tells you to just disconnect the battery and everything will be fine, you know better. If this video helped you, please subscribe to our channel for more practical car guides like this. And if you have ever reset your ECU before and the problem still came back, that usually means the reset was never the real fix.